This is Designing Security Products, where we talk about the intersection of cybersecurity, research, and product design. Today, I'm talking with Daniel Sobel, who has lots of experience in AI and machine learning, product design for indoor labs, for Sonotype, and then also just other experience in the field. So good to see you today, Daniel. Thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, thanks for letting me join you.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to talk with you. I know we chatted a little bit before about some of the things that you're passionate about. But let's start by just tell me a little bit about what you typically do on the day to day and kind of how you got into the security space.
Yeah, totally. So my background is actually in computer science. So I have a pretty deep interest in software engineering, and I really like being in code. So that was kind of my origin story. And then my first role out of school was at a DevOps startup called Puppet, where I got to kind of seep myself into personas who are also technical. And so I've just stayed in the developer tool space ever since. I think it's about 6 years ago, I started to get a little interested in AI ML. So I read an Andre Carpathy paper that kind of blew my mind, his Software 2.0 blog post. And I was like, I gotta get deeper into this particular like segment of software development because it seems really interesting. So since then, I kind of went back to school, got a master's degree in data science, and then I've sort of worked my way into more of a data engineering focus professionally. And so my last two roles have been at Iterative and Prefect, which are both kind of in the data engineering space. My personas have shifted a little bit, but I still like the technical stuff.
Okay, yeah. So you kind of decided to double down on the AI thing a couple of years ago, and unfortunately, it turned out that was just the wrong bet. No one is interested in AI. It's not a hot topic. No one, it's not going to change the world, So sorry about that, man. No, obviously AI is changing everything. I was actually talking with my mom on the drive in to work today and was telling her, she was telling me about something she was trying to work on. I said, well, have you thought about like getting AI to help you put that together? She goes, well, I can do that, can I? I was like, yeah, you should at least create a first draft for you for there. So yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, AI is touching everything and is certainly having an impact on security tools and just the whole security industry, how we manage things. And so I love that you're kind of coming at it from the computer science background. And I know one of the things you had mentioned was kind of the static call graph and reachability analysis. So I don't know anything about those. So tell me tell me a little bit about. Maybe I'm not the only one, right? So tell me a little bit about those and kind of go from there.
Yeah. So one of the security companies I've worked at is this company called Endor Labs. They're a startup. They're growing pretty fast. They closed their Series B recently, so they're kind of one of those rocket ships. But I joined as their founding product designer, and it was a really cool company, in part because they had hired a bunch of PhDs that were trying to do some foundational stuff with security tooling. And one of the things that they were doing is this idea of reachability analysis. So the basic idea is that you've got your code, and you want to scan your code for vulnerabilities. Because most software relies on open source dependencies. And it turns out that like 90% of the code in your application is stuff you didn't write. Whatever tools you use for scanning have got to go into this tree of open source dependencies. So the idea behind reachability analysis is not just that you are scanning that open source tree of dependencies and looking for issues, but you're actually going to make a determination as to whether or not a vulnerability you find in that tree is something that's actually reachable by your code. And the reason why this is really important is because security teams suffer from this issue of like notification fatigue. So you have all of this information coming in, you got to deal with it, and there's just too much. You can't ever get that backlog to zero. So prioritization is super important. And what reachability analysis lets you do is it lets you look at that gigantic list, that gigantic backlog of issues, and say, these are the 10 that are actually reachable. These are the log4js in our software stack that we have to deal with now. And so that's like a really important tool for a development team that's trying to grind through that backlog. And that's what Endor
Okay.
Labs does.
Yeah, very cool. So reachability, does that mean that even though you might have this huge code base, the open source code base that's here, you're not even utilizing half of the functions and features that are in there? So is it kind of looking at those and saying, hey, you're not even using 70% of this. So let's completely, or maybe not completely ignore, but essentially ignore that part and focus on the 30% that is actually being used.
Yeah, and it's a tricky problem because often you can't know for sure until you're actually running something in production, right? Because until you're actually making those calls, a lot of languages are dynamic and you just don't know in advance kind of what calls are being made. So Ender Labs is focused on the static call graph analysis, which is where you look at a application at rest and you scan it and you're like, these are the methods that could be called when it's running. And so it's a very conservative approach, which basically looks at the worst case scenario and then uses that as the basis for where you should prioritize your resources. There are other companies that do the runtime analysis, but the problem with the runtime analysis is that it assumes that your workload is exhaustive enough to basically traverse all the paths that are going to be traversed. So static call graph analysis is going to produce more false positives potentially, but it means you're very unlikely to miss something that is actually important.
Gotcha. And so better, and again, that's that balance between kind of the alert fatigue and missing something important.
Right. And so, like, one thing that we kind of dug into as the designer, I was having to learn this technology on the fly. And so, one of the things that we got into is this fact that it's not really a binary question of whether something is reachable or not. So, there's like this in between category, which is we called potentially reachable, which is basically saying we're not sure. It's a little ambiguous, but it could be reachable. Possibly. And so it gives you an additional gradation of confidence as to kind of whether something needs to be addressed or not. So you have like the rock solid, these are definitely reachable. The stuff in the between, which is like maybe, depending on the language, like it could be, and then the stuff which just isn't, that you can just ignore. So that was how we broke it down.
Okay, nice, nice. And is it true that there are Ewoks working at that company?
But the rumors are true. The rumors are true.
Yeah, it's just amazing that, it seems like they had very primitive technology, but now they're embracing AI. So, yeah.
Our mascot is actually an Ewok, so that's a point of pride. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I figured that was a not so subtle nod to the Star Wars there. So very cool, very cool, awesome. Okay, so I know that another thing we had talked about was kind of this dynamic between the security teams and the developers, and sometimes not that they're at odds, but they have different priorities. So how does UX play into that when you're kind of figuring out how to think about workflows? How do you balance those things?
Yeah, so at Ender Labs, I was the designer in charge of our SaaS UI. And so the SaaS UI is basically taking all this information we're collecting from these scans and presenting it in this interface. And like you say, there's multiple personas. So the interface was primarily for this application security team persona. So it's the people who aren't fixing things, but they're running these scans and they're figuring out what that backlog looks like. So that was kind of the main persona. Because you don't want just a backlog, you want to actually fix it. They have to basically hand off the stuff they think is important to a development team so that they can then go and actually do the remediation. So that's something where it was really tricky because developers are this unique breed of people that don't want yet another dashboard to log into. So you can't just say, here's this amazing new product, here's your login credentials, go crazy. They're just going to ignore it. So I had to think about the handoff between these two personas. And so the approach that we ultimately took at Ender Labs was to kind of lean into the existing tools that developers use, like GitHub, VS Code, the command line, and basically have tools for each of those interfaces that would provide enough of the data in context to be useful, and then provide deep links off to the SaaS UI. So when you really need to dig into a particular issue for remediation, you just click the link and it takes you straight there. And there's no muss about trying to navigate the IA or figure out how to learn yet another SaaS UI. So that was the approach that I took there.
Okay, okay. And did that seem to resonate with your target audience there?
Yeah, we got a lot of. So one of our main competitors is this company called Sneak, and Sneak has a fantastic VS Code extension. And so honestly, what we did was we just looked at that as being kind of the best in class example of like a in context IDE UI for security tooling, and we just sort of borrowed and then added some of our own secret sauce into that experience, and we got a really good response from the developers who used it.
Okay, very cool, very cool. So I know you said that you were you were the founding product designer at Indoor Labs. So, and you mentioned that your key persona was the AppSec folks. So what kind of foundational research did you do to kind of determine, yes, this is our target audience that we really need to build this for, and these are the things they want, and these are the things they don't? Like, tell me a little bit about that process.
Yeah, one of the things that made this experience so cool was that I joined before there was any product whatsoever. So like our CTO made this joke that like we could either be a security company or maybe we would turn everything to a dating app. Like we could go either way. So it was one of those, the sky's the limit, and like there's no preconceived notions of like what we have to be. So that was a really cool thing as a designer to get to play in. And what ended up happening was we did that research by essentially trying to figure out who was going to buy this thing. And so it turned out to me pairing really closely with my boss, who is the CEO. And he was basically on calls all the time with prospects, trying to figure out CISOs specifically, like what they needed from this kind of tool. And so we would have weekly meetings where he would basically come in with all of this information he'd gotten from these prospect calls, and that would get paired with interviews that I was doing on the side, recruiting and user interviews, because we knew that application security teams were our focus. So I was trying to also talk to those users. And we had to kind of eventually hit this point where we were trying to like fit these two stories together, because the CISOs really wanted kind of a high level view. They wanted to understand the overall trends and where things are going. And the application security teams are just like, we're drowning. Like, help us prioritize and not make our development teams hate us. So like those were kind of the two inputs from a research perspective that essentially had to get right sized in the product itself.
Yeah, it's kind of classic, right? And I'm sure it's not just in the security space, but I don't think we've worked on a product where you didn't have at least those two persona categories, right? You've got the CISO. It's almost always the CISO is like one of them. This is the person that is going to be writing the check for this. They have the budget. You've got to prove to them that this product you have, whatever it is, whatever category it's in, is worth the spend. And they want that 10,000 foot view, basically, of here's the stuff that's going on. Okay, looks like everything is moving smoothly, right? I've got a overall view. I can report to the board. I feel like I'm covered. And then you have the practitioner, and that varies on who that practitioner is, right? But those are the people that are actually using the product. And so it's interesting how you always seem to have the features that are in there that people actually use, like the usable features, and then you have the features that kind of help sell the app, right? And it's figuring those out.
It's one of those things where it feels a little bit dirty when you're actually doing it, but ultimately it needs to be a good demo, right? Like you have to be able to give this to a salesperson or your CEO, and they have to be able to show it to some high level purchaser, and the purchaser needs to come away impressed, even if like that dashboard that impressed them isn't going to be used on a daily basis by the actual users. So it was this weird thing where like you feel like you're not really doing UX justice, like, because it's sort of like, but it is, right? Like it's job to be done. It's the buying process, and incorporating that into the product is an important thing to do.
Yeah, I had someone, so Jason and Janice Frazier, kind of foundational UX people, worked at Adaptive Path, which is the first UX design firm that, as far as I know, and so Janice was the founding CEO of that, and so I remember her saying that, imagine that you've got these two circles. One of them is users' needs, and then the other one is the business objectives of whatever the company is that you're working for. And so when you can find where that overlap in the Venn diagram is, that's kind of the sweet spot. But not everything is going to land in that sweet spot, right? So you've got to balance those two things, because if you have the greatest experience in the world, but you can't sell it, then you can't get the tool to the people that need it, and totally. You can't continue as a business, right? So yeah, it seems like everything we're doing is talking about balance, right? It's kind of balancing those two things. It's like the classic phrase of, you ask a question to a UX person and the answer is almost always a variation of, it depends.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you said that you were originally doing some pairing with the CEO in some of these early sales calls, and prospect calls, whatever you want to call it, discovery calls. And so I'm guessing you had a front row seat to those conversations and what was happening. And then you were talking about creating things for the sales team. And you mentioned that the company was growing. So obviously you get to a point where you are no longer in those calls. So did you find it challenging to get feedback from the sales team on these prospect calls to kind of incorporate that into the other research that you were learning on more of the, well, I guess the classic UX research side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a common problem. I tend to be a designer of one, and so I tend to be vastly outnumbered all the time. And so there's always this feeling that there's stuff going on that you're not privy to. It happens a lot, and there's sort of this place you have to arrive as a designer where you just become kind of at peace with the fact that like you understand what your scope of influence is, what you need to be focusing on, and that stuff that's happening outside that bubble is just going to happen, and sometimes it'll mess up your process and your flow, and that's okay because ultimately like your job is to like figure out your top three things that you need to be doing, and then making sure that you're getting the information necessary just for that focus area. And then later, as you check those off, you can kind of reevaluate and maybe pick up on some of those conversations that you've lost track of. So I think there's that kind of dance where it's like you if you have your fingers in all the pies all the time, then you end up having information overload and you can't do your job. So I think there's that kind of balance you have to achieve. And so for
There's that
me,
word again.
yeah, exactly. And for me, like I think the sales calls are interesting because salespeople, they want to close deals. Like they're constantly in the loop with customers. They're happy to pull you in to the extent that you can kind of help them build rapport and trust with their prospects, but it can kind of quickly become a little bit overwhelming. And so what I tend to do is early on in a process for a greenfield product like this, I like to be pretty plugged in with sales because there's not much going on the product side yet. We're still trying to figure out product market fit. But once you have a sense that you're at product market fit, that's really when I like to kind of dig in deep to the technical development side of the house. Because once I feel like I understand the framework in which we need to work from like a business perspective, then I like to really do what I enjoy the most and really dig into the technology and understand deeply from a first principles perspective what we're building and like how to make sure that it's exposed to users in a thoughtful way. So at Endor Labs, kind of those early days was definitely plugged in with the CEO a lot. And then I gradually kind of shifted more towards the CTO side of the house, and kind of shifted who I thought of as my primary stakeholder from a research perspective.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes that can be challenging. We've worked with a couple of different security teams, and so sometimes the sales team is very open and are very understand this thing of, hey, if we can do some research, we can build a better product that'll be easier for you to sell. And sometimes they're like, don't really. I'm like, this person's in the sales funnel. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
really want you talking to them and messing up what I've got going on here. I feel like we're this close to closing the deal. So they're afraid, and I get it. But have you found any tips or tricks for navigating that?
I've made so many mistakes working with sales and marketing teams. Honestly, I think, like you say, they have a process. They have kind of this desire to not upset the apple cart and make a mess of their relationships. And I think as a designer, I'm always wanting to ask questions and learn, but sometimes I can come across as being uncertain and not knowing kind of what your product is or does. So I think that can really clash with what a sales and marketing team is trying to doing, which is to project confidence and like an opinion and to like make it look as though your product is on rails and will solve the problem. And so that is definitely something I've stubbed my toe on a number of times, and I've had to learn to kind of be sensitive to kind of what those teams are trying or are grappling with, so that I can provide the most value to them when I'm engaging with their process. It is an interesting balance. Once again,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Have you found that sometimes the best way to get information from the person you're testing with or interviewing is to kind of play dumb and act like you don't know, or I'll say sometimes I've acted like I don't understand what they're talking about, so they'll explain it better. But then sometimes I genuinely don't understand and I need them to explain it. Have you found that works pretty well, or?
yeah, the way that I was taught to do research is essentially to reflect questions back to people. So when they are like, "Is it supposed to work this way?" or like, does this button do this? I always kind of ask it back to them, like, what do you think this button does, or like, where do you think it goes? And it is kind of like playing dumb, like you say, and it can feel a little bit awkward, but it definitely, I don't think I've ever run across a user who's been offended at the fact that I'm not answering their question. I'm just asking it back to them. So I think like there's a lot to be said for not making assumptions and making sure that anything a user is thinking is really brought out into the open and is very, very clear, even if it means asking their question back to them. So that's something I do a lot. But again, like I think, especially when you're in some conversations where the team is trying to project like confidence, that can really backfire. So I think it's important to understand the type of conversation that you're having and what the goals are, on the part of the people on your team that are on the call, and then kind of execute accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're wearing your research hat, it's very different from when you're wearing your sales hat, right? They have very, very different roles there. So when you're having these conversations where you're going to reflect the question back, ask them the question, have you found that it helps to kind of set that up at the beginning of the session and kind of let them know, hey, I'm going to ask you, you might ask a question of me and you're wanting to figure out what's going to happen. And I'm really wanting to know how you're going to react. So I don't want you to get offended. I'm going to just ask you to kind of say what's in your head and kind of let them know up front kind of why you're going to use that. I don't know that you would use the word technique when you're talking with them, but have you ever tried that, and does that seem to be effective?
It, to be honest, I haven't. The way I tend to structure my interviews is I'll usually have like an intro where I'm like, here's what we're covering today. So there are no surprises. Like it's a task based, session. You're going to be asked to do things, but usually I don't go into the techniques I use when interviewing. Um, that said, sometimes I'll have people come back and say like, I've never been in a session before. I'm really nervous. Like
Yeah,
what should I expect so that I do what you need me to do? And then I just try to put them at ease and say like, you seriously can't offend me. Like, say what's on your mind, be transparent, and that usually is as far as I need to go. But
I
it's
gotcha.
an interesting question. Yeah, I do think there's a lot of curiosity around what good research looks like, and even like users who are aware of what design is, which is increasingly a thing, will sometimes want to dive a little bit deeper than just session level stuff.
Sure. Oh gosh, yeah. When they dig in on something, you're like, that's really interesting. I love that you want to tell me about the fonts and the colors that are here, but that's not really what we're trying to figure out.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like herding cats.
Sometimes it is. I will say the one question or the one thing that I do always say at the beginning of a session is I want to make sure you know that we are not testing you. We are testing the application. You can't do anything wrong. So if something is confusing to you, that's on us, not on you. And that's the reason we're talking to you to help it make it less confusing for everyone else. So that is one of the things that is in my open.
Yep. Yeah. And like the people I love talking to the most are the people who just have no filters and just
Yes.
it's literally a stream of consciousness, and everything that they think they say, as opposed to somebody who's like sitting there and they're just scratching their head and like, why, what's going on? But they're not really talking out loud. I really love the no filter participants.
Yes, the ones that are just kind of speaking aloud. I'm looking for the search box, but I don't see it. Oh, there it is, right up there. That. Yeah, that's gold when they're like that. Yeah. Have you experimented much with where you're letting the user do the clicking and moving around versus where you're actually the one that's doing the clicking, like on a clickable prototype or something, and they have to tell you where to move? Have you done both types of those? And is there one that you think seems to work better than the other?
Yeah. So one approach that I'll use is if I'm really early in the design process, I don't want to put in the effort to put together a whole prototype. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll put together a low fidelity mock in Figma, and I'll show this to a user and I'll just ask them like, what do you think would happen if you were to click that button? Right? Like I'll just have them role play for me and tell me what they would expect to happen. Because, you know, part of the thing about being a good designer is knowing how to put together interfaces that are just not surprising. Things happen the way you think they're going to happen. And so I found that often you can have people tell you what they think would happen, and that turns out to be often a reasonable first pass at what the thing should actually be. So that's kind of a nice thing to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Or sometimes it happens all the time where I might have a clickable prototype, but then there's nothing behind this button that's right here.
Right.
So let's say, well, I would click on that. It says, well, that actually doesn't go anywhere. But what would you expect to see when you clicked on that? And then sometimes sometimes they'll say kind of what you already had planned, and sometimes they'll say, well, I thought it would probably have this information. Like, oh wow, I didn't even realize that was important. That's super interesting. I need to dig in a little more on this. So yeah, sometimes the, well, what do you think would happen question is a good one.
And sometimes it can be useful to present a design that's a little bit controversial or a little bit wrong, because
Yeah,
sometimes that can be a trigger to get someone to give you a reaction or to say something that they might not otherwise have bothered to say. So sometimes it can be useful going out on a limb and just like, I know this is wrong, but what do you think? And that can sometimes be a really effective strategy too. Yeah, especially with internal stakeholders, because again, like the information overload is a real thing in companies where people are pinged on Slack all day and there's just so much going on. So like sometimes putting out something there in Slack that's just subtly wrong can kind of trigger that, thing in people where something's wrong with the internet and I have to say something about it. It can be a really useful technique.
yeah, I completely agree. So we're talking about the value of talking with the target audience, right? With these users and doing user testing. How, let me ask it a different way. So we're talking about doing user research and the value of that. But sometimes because the target audience we're looking for is so specific, and then also if they're in security, sometimes people that are in security are maybe a little more cagey and a little less willing to share than maybe other industries. Maybe that's an overgeneralization. So it can be a challenge finding these folks and convincing them to get into a research session with you, because a lot of times they get sold to and you have to convince them that I'm not selling you anything, I'm just wanting to find out. So have there been what has been some of the most successful techniques that you've used for finding people to do the research with?
Yeah, finding good candidates is really hard. I tend to use tools like user interviews with just like a survey to sort of screen people, but honestly, it's a bit hit or miss. So, one of the things with security products and like data heavy products in general is that it's really hard, even if you have a good participant, it's sometimes really hard for them to give good feedback when they're not looking at their own data. So, like if I give someone a prototype and it's got a bunch of lorem ipsum or even just like real data, but it's not their data, they don't really know how they would actually react to the interface because it's not stuff that they're intimately familiar with. So one thing that I will tend to do when I run into those situations where like they're either more cagey or they just are a little bit more reluctant to give you good feedback is I'll try to kind of move to a code prototype where you're actually able to feed in real data, especially when you're working with an existing customer or a prospect who's interested in doing a POC. You can often give them something that's like a prototype that they can spin up and populate with data and then just like try it out on their own end and not even have to show you their screen live and give you feedback asynchronously. And that can be a way to kind of get a little bit more detail from somebody who otherwise might not give you what you because sometimes you can't just get around the problem of our data's proprietary, we can't tell you anything about it, but we can maybe give you a summary of our experience using your tool in a POC type environment.
Yeah, we've completely, and I feel like some of the tools that seem to be coming out every day on the AI front of kind of taking a mock or even just some prompts and coming up with some type of a clickable prototype. We've been experimenting with those, and it seems like that is becoming easier and easier to be able to do. So, are there any tools that you've played around with that you're like, oh, this one I'm not so big on this one, but this one over here, man, that one is fantastic.
Yeah, I have a lot of opinions on this. So I've been using these tools for several months on a pretty much daily basis. And because I have a software engineering background, I actually tend to gravitate towards the ones like Cursor and Windsurf that are a little bit more like agentic coders as opposed to like the V0 bolts that are more like UI first.
Mhm.
And for me, that really works well because one of the things with agents is they tend to go off the rails. So when I'm putting together a prototype, you type in a sentence, you have it generate something, and obviously it's going to be super wrong or super like not what you were thinking. So I really like working in small increments, so that I can kind of keep a tight leash and also learn, right? Like I want to get better at React, and if I'm moving in small increments and asking the agent what it's doing along the way, I can get better at coding, right? So this kind of serves two purposes. But I really like those tools. And I think even like on the visual side, you can like paste in screenshots or use an MCP server, to have them open a browser and take screenshots to like gradually iterate towards the thing that you're actually trying to build, but you have to do it kind of in slow increments. And that's kind of been my approach.
Yeah, and it seems the one part that seems to be missing still is being able to use it to come up with something that has actual usable code, right? Like there's snippets and pieces that are in here that you're like, okay, this is good, this is good. And again, you may have a different perspective than me, but you can't say, hey, create this mock, and then it creates something that uses the framework that you're using in the modules and other stuff like that. Like it'll get you close, but you're going to have to go and dig for a little bit of the gold that's in there to actually have something that's ready for production. Now, again, you've got a coding background, so maybe you're like, actually, William, that's not true.
I have a working theory
Okay.
that Figma is no longer necessary.
Nope.
And for that theory to be true, it has to be possible to assemble a component library in code, iterate on it effectively in code, and basically just never touch Figma. Basically, be able to point an agent at your component library and say, like, go nuts, use these components and like make me an interface that I can iterate on. And I think we're getting there. Like I feel like we're at a place where even if it's not my own component library, but it's like Material UI or Base UI, there's a lot of frameworks now where you can actually download a single markdown file that contains all of that framework's documentation. You can upload to the context window of the agent you're working with. So it will know exactly kind of the correct usage for that framework. And it won't hallucinate, methods that don't exist. It'll actually like work and iterate towards a functional interface. And then you can layer on your own layout components and like page components, and so that it understands kind of your style and what an application should look like in your context. And I think we're like, I'd say 70% of the way there. I can definitely see a path to a lot of Figma's functionality being superseded by agentic coding tools, which is really exciting to me personally as someone who likes to be in code. Because like one of my big frustrations of my career, and this was true at Ender Labs, is I'd put together a design system, and now you have this Herculean task of keeping it in sync with the code base. And I just love this idea that we can unify these two things and just have one source of truth for the design artifacts to really make that design engineering handoff easier, and for designers to be able to like still iterate and design effectively in that medium. So that's my hope. I think we can get there pretty soon.
Okay. All right. Is there one tool that you think is the closest right now to being able to do that?
I have a side project actually where I'm trying to kind of explore different interface paradigms that can give designers better visibility into kind of that code base from a design perspective, but I haven't seen a tool that really nails it. So like the coding part I think is getting close to solved, but like understanding my component library visually and then be able to make changes to it, some tools are doing interesting things. So like if I'm in, I think Lovable does this, if I'm iterating on a prototype, I can be typing in my text prompts, but in that chat you'll get like custom UI, which lets you tweak individual properties of specific components.
Okay.
That kind of feels a little bit like a Figma thing, but it's custom UI that is tweaked depending upon what you're building. So I think we're starting to see tools getting closer to this, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Okay. Gotcha. Very cool. Very cool. Dude, this has been awesome kind of digging in on all of the AI stuff. It's been fantastic. One question I always love to ask is, can you tell me about a time when something went wrong or you had a wrong assumption, and then what did you do to kind of resolve that or fix or maybe just even learn from it?
Yeah, totally. So the thing about me is that I know enough about coding to be dangerous. And so I will often come into technical products with certain assumptions that are just wrong. And
Mm,
sometimes this bites me. So one story I have is at Ender Labs, one feature that I was working on is you need to be able to scan your code. And so there's the CLI you're running, you're scanning code. And the code lives in a repository usually, like GitHub. And so in my simplified brain, I was like, okay, cool. So we have the repository. There's this main branch. That's what you're deploying from. You got to be able to scan that main branch and then see kind of a history of your scans in the UI. So I went and put together a design with this mental model. and showed it in my weekly sync with our CEO and CTO. And that meeting went downhill really fast because it turns out that when you're scanning code, it's really a lot more complicated than just scanning main, because what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to think of it as more of a matrix. So you have all these branches and all these tags that you're scanning over time. And the reason why this is really important is that some companies will maintain a 1.0 version of their old software alongside their 2.0 version. And you have to be able to scan both of these in parallel, because when companies using that software, they're not just migrating everything instantaneously. So there's like a lag. And so any tool that works with code has to be really cognizant of the fact that you're dealing with a very complex maintenance, window, and any solution has to account for that. And so this meeting ended up being kind of a half hour to an hour education for me, learning what software maintenance looks like, so that I can kind of go back and make sure that that was accurately accounted for in the solution. But I think it's really good to work with people who are able to really call bullshit when they see it, and like say, like, this is what the actual way that a developer, for example, works in the real world. Because otherwise, I think the further you get along the design process with bad assumptions, the more expensive it is to fix things after the fact. So I think it's really important to have those. And my only regret is that I didn't like have that light bulb moment earlier in my process. But better fixed than
Yeah, well, and sometimes you better learn when there's a little pain and frustration that's involved in it, rather than if you just kind of made that adjustment earlier, right? So it sticks in your brain more like, okay, I don't want to go through that again.
Yeah, the big lesson, honestly, for me is that it's really good to, when you get into a meeting like that, it's really good to not have surprises and to like make sure that everyone's on the same page before you even get to the meeting. So it's not a formality, but like you don't come in there and then have these huge discoveries that make everything blow up and essentially waste everybody's time. So like there's this balance between needing to make sure that you understand what people's needs are and expectations are going in, but also having the space be able to take that and build on it and
Yeah,
have room for creativity. Because sometimes you come in with a solution that's 80% correct, and now you just got to like get it to 100%. And that's a really good use of meetings like that, I think.
yeah, absolutely. Is it kind of like, these are my assumptions? Are those correct? And then people can push back on those and say, okay, cool. Now that we've established this, let's build on
Yes.
top of that. If not, then let's obviously this 50% that's in the middle here is wrong. So let's delay the conversation about that. Let's build on these structures over here on the side in this meeting, and then we'll come back and hit on that other stuff when I have her assumptions.
100%.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Dude, this has been just like a knowledge drop. I mean, we've talked about EWOX, we've talked about machine learning, we've talked about AI tools, we've talked about all kinds of techniques. This has been super, super insightful to me, and hopefully the people that are listening to this, it'll be insightful to them as well. So, Daniel, man, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, and I hope your side project goes really well. Anything else that you want to share that I should have asked a question about, or anything else to share?
I mean, the only thing I'd say is I think AI and security are going to be this really interesting space going forward, because I think some of the things that AI is really good at are things that security professionals are weak at. So like, for example, I mentioned the deluge of information. I think it's really important to be able to lean on tools like AI that are great at things like pattern matching and interpolation, and even bringing domain expertise, that maybe you don't have expertise in that one transitive dependency deep in your code, but like AI probably does. So I think there's going to be a lot of tools you see that are adopting some of these AI superpowers to like make security products even better. So like that's one thing I might call out, is just thinking about it's going to be an
Okay.
interesting time.
Yeah, so if anyone's listening to this and they're kind of figuring out, how do I fit into this new AI revolution that's happening, then sounds like that might be, from someone with your experience, sounds like that might be a good place to dig in. Awesome. Dude, it's been great talking with you today. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I appreciate it.